Hello, and welcome to Earnscliffe Strategies webinar, President Biden's Visit to Canada, Assessment, Analysis, and a Look Towards 2024. I'm your host, Bud Locklear, Principal with Earnscliffe Strategies, a national leader in strategic communications, government relations, and opinion research with offices in Ottawa, Toronto, Saskatoon, and Vancouver. Thank you, viewers, for joining us. We want you to be part of this conversation, so please consider posing questions in the Zoom Q&A function. I'm very pleased to have Sarah Goldfeder, Eric Miller, and Beth Palmer on our panel. Welcome, panelists. Let's set the stage for the President's visit to Canada. Some of the questions I've been thinking about are, what are the eternal political dynamics in each capital at this juncture? How are those dynamics shaping the agenda we see here in Ottawa? So, Beth, let's start with you. Tell us about the Canadian position.
For sure. So thanks for having me. It's great to be here. First time I've been able to meet Eric, and lovely to see Sarah and Bud again. So first off, this is a really important relationship for the Prime Minister, not just because of the proximity, the historic ties between Canada and the US, not just because of the extent to which, honestly, our economy is really shaped by that of the United States. We've come off of, and it's been a while, but we've come off of 4 pretty tumultuous years with the previous administration, and Trudeau's team has really effectively reorganized themselves, I would say, to meet the needs of that relationship. So there was a bit of relief, and I think also some excitement when Biden was elected 2 years ago. Trudeau and his team had sort of a very strong relationship that they really like to put in the window with President Obama. So this sort of harkens back to that. So I think that there was quite a bit of excitement. It gives them a lot to sort of look forward to. There's also, I think, a perception within the Prime Minister's office that there's a lot of shared values that can be leveraged to not only advance the Canadian and American interests, but really to demonstrate the value of progressive governments on the world stage. And this offers an opportunity for them to do that. We saw that sort of right at the outset after Biden was elected with the roadmap for a renewed Canada-US partnership, where both leaders sort of jointly championed, building back better, diversity and inclusion, addressing climate change, as well as promoting the rights of the human rights and democracy. So we're seeing sort of like that piece, but at the same time, there's a lot of challenges, I think, that come with this particular moment. First off, there's the outsized scale that the US can roll out an industrial policy. We're seeing that with the Inflation Reduction Act. It's going to really drive policy here, but also, I think, really, frankly, dwarf it. There's a quote from Biden, and I'm hesitant to quote in this age of the internet, but something along the lines of, don't tell me your values, show me your budget, and I'll tell you your values. And we see there are places, I think, where Canada's values from the budget, in Canadian budgets, massive transfers on the Canada Health Transfer, investments into $10 a day daycare across the country. And I need to be clear, I think that those are major investments into Canadian productivity and prosperity, but they are not reframing the economy in the same way as the Inflation Reduction Act is sort of aiming to move the needle. So there are, I think, some areas of tension that they're going to have to work out. And you would have seen leading up to during the planning for this meeting, these different priorities, they would have ironed out sort of what they're going to talk about and also the areas that they're going to avoid talking about. This is not the moment for a gotcha moment. So I do think there's some tensions here, and we've seen a bit of the rolling out in advance. But one of the, I think, other challenges that Trudeau's facing with this is that he is currently facing a ton of distractions. So I'm speaking about the budget. The budget is in 4 or 5 days. And that means that any sort of deliverables from this meeting will have a pretty short shelf life. Again, our timelines are such that the news cycle, most deliverables have a short timeline, but this is really we're not going to have a lot of time to digest what comes out of these meetings. There's also ongoing and very live allegations around Chinese interference that are taking up a lot of oxygen. I can't really even begin to say how unhelpful it is that the day before the president landed, we had a sitting MP announced that he was leaving caucus. Like, it's just, this is going to take up a lot of space. And I think that there's some challenges here that this meeting won't be able to sort of drive forward the sort of policy and narrative that the Trudeau team is looking to move at this point.
Thank you, Beth. Excellent. Eric, set some context for us.
Yeah, so I think this meeting comes at a very interesting time. President Biden is starting to look ahead towards a re-election campaign. And you've seen the world is at a very interesting inflection point. And so we are a year into the war in Ukraine, which has refocused the conversation about security in Europe. You've just had the Chinese spy balloons, plural, fly over in North America, which has reframed the conversation about Arctic and about continental defense. You've also seen the Inflation Reduction Act, which, as Beth has pointed out, is having a transformational role in key parts of the US economy, particularly related to transition to net zero. And so the visit comes at a time when both leaders are facing a lot of change. The Trudeau government is well along in its time in office, which means that many of the initial ideas that they ran on are not ones that are really at the forefront now, and they've been in the thick of governing at the moment. And so a key thing to note, of course, is that whenever the US president and the Canadian prime minister get together, that is a good thing. And there are a lot of issues that need to get dealt with that will get some time and attention. But fundamentally, I think we're seeing a need for a bigger discussion about what does this new world of geopolitical competition, of protectionism, of instantaneous communications that are often dominated by imperfect or false information that are roiling democratic systems around the world. These are all things where we have to start thinking about our collective institutions in North America and what each country is doing. And that's not something that I think necessarily has been advanced enough, and that we hope that the next time the Canadian Prime Minister and the US President get together, that conversation will be further advanced. But for now, it will be a lot on what's going to happen on Inflation Reduction Act, Buy American. Is Canada actually going to spend more on defense? What's it going to do on Arctic? But these are symptoms of a broader set of shifts in the world that I think are going to need to be seriously analyzed and be responded to in the form of long-term institution building within the bilateral relationship.
Thank you, Eric. Sarah.
Thank you. And it's really nice to be back with the Earnscliffe team for at least an hour on a Friday afternoon, and good to see Eric. I think one of the things that, one of the mandates that we have in our minds as lobbyists is that you don't ask for a meeting unless you have something to talk about, or you're trying to build a relationship. So, our meetings fall into those two buckets. And I think this is a relationship underscoring meeting. It's not so much a big deliverable meeting. And I think we've seen, and both Beth and Eric have kind of talked about this, there's lots of ongoing discussions between these two countries, but this is not a meeting where we have the United States president coming to Canada with a, I need this from you today kind of ask. This is more formative. This is something that is an ongoing conversation. And I think, honestly, one of the things that you notice, and I remember from my time in the embassy, I'm sure, Bud, you remember this as well, the conversations that happened between Ottawa and Washington actually happened between Ottawa and Washington. Rather than happening between, within the diplomatic community in Ottawa, there is a strong role for the ambassadors, but a lot of that conversation is direct between the two governments, and it goes very deep into the infrastructure of those governments. And I think that's really important to remember as we look at this visit. It was the scale of it tells you a lot. Coming in for a family dinner, essentially last night. And if you haven't looked at Adam Scotty's photographs of that evening, they're adorable. And it was clearly a relationship building, underscoring type of exercise within those two families. And that's really, I think, what defines this relationship. This is about a family relationship between Canada and the United States. We often talk about the partnerships and the integration, and I think that that's really what this visit is all about, is underscoring all of those ties. And really, you know, Condoleezza Rice talked about the condominium issues. This is where we're at still in this relationship. There are lots of little things that we need to work on that feel very big to the stakeholders that are involved. But when you look at the, you know, the broad swath of history, these are things that, you know, 20, 25 years from now, we'll probably still be working on them, and they probably won't have hit the front page of anything yet. So it was nice to see the leaks kind of coming out on the immigration issues, also on the budget issues for Canada. I think that plays really nicely into the conversations. They clearly wanted to do some work within PMO as they're gathering all of these binational stakeholders together for this dinner tonight, so that they have some sort of sense of where the Canadian government is going on Tuesday with their budget. Just also to point out, you know, it wasn't too long ago that we had the president of the EU in Ottawa for her parliamentary address and her event. And there was lots of things that were different. Number one, the security. I think you could still actually drive around downtown Ottawa when she was here. But I think the other thing we have to remember is that Canada often gets caught in between these two entities. But really, at the end of the day, trade and geography will define Canada's future economic growth. So Europe is important. It's important to both the United States and to Canada. But when we look at trade and we look at the economic relationship, the relationship that matters the most really is between Canada and the United States.
Thank you, Sarah. Excellent insights and fantastic context from each of you. Now I want to pose a question to each of you as individuals, kind of a headliner question. I'm going to start with Beth again. So Beth, you noted that the PM has a lot of domestic challenges. The foreign election interference scandal seems to be deepening. The Liberals are down in the polls, it appears. Some commentators are suggesting that the Prime Minister and advisors, you know, really want more than anything to change the channel, change the political channel. And they hope that this visit is going to do that. So let's dig into what Canada's top concerns are about the relationship, and what would the President and PM have to announce that would take some heat off the Prime Minister?
Yeah, I think building off of, you know, Sarah's comments and the emphasis on this as sort of a familial trip, it really does show deep personal ties. I will say where the PM and his family are living, like, it is a family home. It's not like an official residence. So inviting in the leader of another country into a space like that, it's very intimate. And I think that is building off of really what they are hoping to accomplish with this, is demonstrating how close these ties are. And that, I think, is going to be, and how close these ties are and how long standing this relationship is, both Canada and the US, but also really cementing Trudeau within that. It has a very close relationship with this administration. So I think in terms of deliverables, we have seen the announcement of the Safe Third Country Agreement, the changes that are going to be happening, closing Roxham Road. That's been a huge political issue for Trudeau, but I think, again, it really does demonstrate the extent to which our problems are at a different scale. This is not the same as the Southern American border. With that, I think my understanding, and I don't think anything's been officially announced, but Canada will take on sort of legal migrants in sort of exchange for closing that, and will also, I believe, make a fairly significant investment into support for Haiti. So that kind of covers off two pieces. But again, this is, I would say, working to sort of fix a political issue, and it would be nice if they're able to announce something that's a bit more sort of move forward net, a good news story as opposed to solving a problem, though that I think solving these political problems will be helpful for both leaders. So I think Canada is going to be looking for alignment on climate change, really working to demonstrate that their narrative of, the environment and the economy can work together, and having a validator on that front, I think, will be helpful. They're going to be looking, I think, further to Eric's point, to demonstrate the extent to which we're really partners with NORAD, Arctic sovereignty. But again, I think these are uneven partnerships. So that's going to be a tension that we're going to have to keep sort of seeing. And I would say, like, the pressure on this visit in terms of demonstrating that close relationship, it is on. I would say Trudeau and Obama had a very, very close relationship. We saw that even sort of, publicly meeting up following after Obama had left the office. And I think this visit will sort of work to build on that, but also kind of refocus it a bit. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how things shake out over the next, I guess, few hours at this point.
Yeah. Thanks, Beth. Eric, so like Prime Minister Trudeau, the President of the United States faces, numerous challenges, but as Beth intimated, there's on a much bigger, much broader scale, global scale. What can this visit to Ottawa deliver of political value to President Biden back home? And, essentially, what are the U.S. asks? And, how's this going to really work in the president's advantage?
So certainly the president is looking ahead to the 2024 presidential election, and demonstrating his role as a leader on the global stage is something that is very helpful. Also, there is truth to the idea that building a partnership of like-minded progressive governments is something that is attractive to him. But fundamentally, the top US ask coming into this particular visit has to do with defense, because what you've seen is Canada, like many countries in NATO over the years, has not met its commitment to spend 2% of its GDP on national defense. And so the perception in Washington is that the US sees Canada as somewhat of a free rider when it comes to defense spending. And so in the context of what we've seen as very real demonstrated threats in the Arctic with the spy balloon, in the context of the very real threats in Ukraine, and the fact that Canada and the US have both shipped significant amounts of materiel to Ukraine, as well as providing diplomatic and other support, we are in a situation where not only do stockpiles need to be renewed, but the whole role of defense within foreign policy is being reimagined, because at the same time as you have Ukraine, you also have growing tensions in the South China Sea. And the sense is that part of where the Europe relationship, the Japan relationship, and the Canada relationship come into the US picture is that you have more or less liberal democratic countries that are on one side of the equation, and then you have the Putin, Xi Jinping, no limits partnership on the other side of the equation. And so just like you've seen Russia attack Ukraine, you also have greater Chinese pressure on Taiwan. And what you've seen, even in the discussions around Canada in or out of AUKUS, is the fact that unless you're willing to invest in certain capabilities, you're not going to be at the top table. And so from the perspective of Canada, you're going to see a US administration not just asking the usual asks of, can you increase your defense spending? But there's an urgency that underpins this now. And so if this is able to translate into money in the budget for systems, if the procurement processes that Canada has engaged in are accelerated, that's something that the US is actually going to see as very much of a win, because we were allies in the post-Cold War period, but there weren't a lot of real-time threats because you had basically unchallenged US hegemony. Now that you do not have that and you have a contested international system, the ability to project hard power along with the ability to project soft power becomes really, really crucial. So I think a key US ask here will be, can Canada be convinced, not only as a government, but as a society, that spending more on defense and having a robust hard power option is something that's really important.
Thank you, Eric. It's an excellent point that it's not just about convincing It's not about convincing government that there's a valid expense. It's convincing the Canadian population that have been probably taking it for granted that the defense spending is really just not a really big thing. Sarah, next question is to you. And this is actually, I was going to ask you about the EU-US dynamic where Canada fits in. You've kind of addressed that a little bit earlier, but let's dig into that, because when EC President van der Leyen was here, there was a discussion about critical minerals, and that was a big part of the rollout. We see that Secretary Granholm accompanied President Biden, and that DOE's world, Department of Energy's world, is critical minerals. Is there really a sweet spot for Canada between these? I mean, does Canada have to choose between the US and the EU?
I mean, I think geography makes that choice, right? But I think there are ways to kind of cooperate with both. And I think one of the things that's important is when you look at what the EU has done, the EU has traditionally led on a lot of the frameworks for some of these issues, right? Whether it's digital with, the GDPR and their push towards an AI framework, or whether it's critical minerals, their critical mineral strategy was, I think, came out in 2016. And so we're about 5 years behind when we first started talking about it here in Canada. So there's a little bit of catch up on the framing and the strategy, but in the reality of things, Canada has natural resources, it has critical minerals, it has rare earth elements, it has a mining culture, and it has land, and it has the processing abilities and the land to put those processing abilities on, and it is right next door to the world's largest car market. So, for a lot of the stuff on EVs, we're in a great position, and one that Europe, frankly, just doesn't share. It is a lot of energy, carbon emissions, and money to move stuff across the Atlantic Ocean. And so I think that you will continue to see the relationship between Canada and the United States, especially on critical minerals, only deepen. And I think one of the things I take out of the late addition of Jennifer Granholm to this delegation and the position of Jake Sullivan in there is that the United States looks at critical minerals and rare earth elements as something that involves national security. So it's not just the national economic interest of these two countries, it is in the national security interest of these two countries to ensure that these, the mining, the processing, and the development of new technologies happen here. And so I think that will be a lot of the discussion with them and their counterparts. And I think that that really underscores a lot of what we're probably going to see in the budget on Tuesday, we hope, where we see a little bit more actual investment into what it's going to take to participate in this new economy. Because I think one of the things that gets overlooked is that there's a lot of capital investment that's going to come at high cost with low return in the first few years. And so in order to make these things work, and you have two countries that have committed to a transition to electric vehicles, you have to have government participation. You have to have government support. And while the Strategic Innovation Fund is something that this government developed back when it first came into its mandate in 2015, it's been modified over the years to try to take on a whole lot of other issues. And at a certain point, you're building, you're building a structure that begins to have weaknesses and soft spots within it. And so girding that up with other tools, perhaps, or girding up that actual process is going to be something that I think is of interest to both countries, because there is an understanding within the United States government that Canada is the partner on these things, right? Canada is considered a domestic partner on critical minerals within the Defense Production Act for investment. They haven't, we're not an afterthought. We are definitely part of the conversation. And I think that that's going to be a huge piece of it. And with the EU, there's a lesser role there, I think, both on geography and on the availability of resources, land, and talent.
But if I can come in on that just
Please.
For a second, because I work a lot on critical minerals. So in fairness to North America, yes, Europe started developing a strategy early, but it was only last June that they actually announced that, yes, we fully accept that all the critical minerals we need are not found within the EU borders, and we need a strategy to go get them. But the real challenge and the real determinant of Canada's success in this area is, can it get mines permitted, built, get the infrastructure in place to get the materials out of where they're located into processing infrastructure quickly? And so all of this involves a lot of different dimensions and a lot of different pieces. And in some of this, there's a role for government. In some of this, there's a role for companies. But to have critical minerals in the ground sitting there is it's a necessary but not a sufficient condition. In order to make it actually real, you have to mine the minerals, which means you got to get permitted, built. And to build a typical mine today, your kind of best case scenario is 12 to 15 years to get it permitted, financed, designed, go through the 3 stages of feasibility and all the rest of it. And that's not fast enough. And so we need to do a whole series of different things in order to be able to get those minerals out, have the infrastructure to get them to refineries, and then to be able to get them into the hands of companies like GM that can put them into EV batteries. Unless we also forget that there's still, besides the battery space, there's still a whole lot of other applications. And so one of the things, for example, you learn about cobalt is it makes paint dry. And so, paint drying doesn't sound very exciting by definition, but it's actually really, really important. And so, as we transition to the green economy, on the upstream side, it's about getting the minerals out and getting them to market faster. And on the downstream side, it's things like, can individual property owners sell electricity through charging stations, or does that have to be owned only by utilities? And what is the incentive structure to put infrastructure in place? So the green transition is a great objective, but what's going to determine its success or failure is all of the 1,000 steps in between the mine in Northern Ontario and the charging infrastructure at the shopping mall in Red Deer.
I love it. One of the things which is my mantra is that a lot of people think the energy transition is going to be, cheap, fast, and easy. And of course, it's going to be really long, really hard, and really expensive. I want to bring Beth in here to kind of connect some of the dots, talking about the difficulty of moving into getting mines done more quickly. There's another really important rights holder in this question, that Canada is on the verge of trying to address systemic inequality and problems centuries old. And so the draft action plan for the Canadian government's United Nations Declaration Act with respect to Indigenous peoples was released this past Monday, with a long list of actions that need to happen. At the end of the day, much of these critical minerals, much of this transition to a net zero future will depend on partnership with Indigenous nations who on whose territories these materials exist. How much difficulty is there in trying to get that to work and plug into this important bilateral, even trilateral conversation, EU, Canada, and the United States, with lots of moving pieces? Beth.
Yeah, so this is also, this adds another layer of complexity, I think, to what you've described as long, hard, and expensive. The reality is that the value that Canada can bring, both in terms of the critical minerals that we have, but also on, a commitment to ensuring regulations that meet environmental standards, bringing in Indigenous people, that's again like a longer term goal. This is sort of part of a very broad understanding of sustainability, but it will make things harder, and it will require a lot of work. And I think building up these partnerships, it's going to be a challenge. But I think that as we look forward to sort of a very, very long-term approach to how we're dealing with critical minerals and this economy that is transitioning towards a more green economy, like that idea of sustainability, I think needs to thread through. And I think you're right, Beth, like getting there is going to take work. And it's going to have to be ongoing work. This is not a checkbox exercise. It's an ongoing partnership building, making sure that the right people are at the table and that the buy-in is very, it runs very deep. It's not sort of a superficial piece.
Can I chime in on that as well?
Please.
Because I think that this is something that we have to remember as we look towards this transition to electric vehicles. When we talk about zero emissions vehicles, the people we're selling this notion to are not only concerned with the emissions of the vehicle, they're concerned with everything that goes into it, and they're concerned with all of the processes, that they are done ethically, that they are done sustainably, and that they're done responsibly over time. And so that's part of the move that was begun within the renegotiation of NAFTA, and there's a lot of the roots of these ideas inside that trade agreement. And there was a lot of doubling down on that within the IRA. So what we actually see is, in the light of sustainability and ethical processes and producer responsibility, a model that's going to put Canada with a strict regulatory regime in the center of a lot of these things. And I think one of the things that's important is, when we talk about the additional consultations that we undergo in order to produce these things in Canada, it's not about lessening the regulatory burden. It's about speeding up the processes. And I think that is really critical as we look towards what the future brings. Consumers don't want to purchase a car that they don't feel good about. They don't want to purchase anything they don't feel good about. I used to have this thing with my kids when we would be tourists somewhere and they wanted to go buy something in a souvenir shop. I'm like, we can go buy something from a souvenir shop if it was actually made here, wherever we're at here. And if it wasn't made here, it's not actually a souvenir. And so, like, having that conversation globally of what responsible manufacturing looks like is, I think, something that the United States, the Biden administration, and the Trudeau government want to do together. And they want to do it within the confines and within the constraints of the trade agreements that they've both signed on to. And I think the other thing that's really important, looking back to our conversation on the EU, is Canada has this relationship with the EU. We have CETA in force. It is actually going pretty well as trade agreements and trade relationships go. The United States has yet to finish their negotiations on the EU agreement, and it may be a long way off. And so Canada is uniquely well placed to take advantage of both markets and really provide an opportunity for manufacturers of goods who want to sell into both markets.
Yeah, but just to draw a contrast on this, on the First Nations point, and so one of the areas where I think Canada is beginning to do quite well is in helping to build the infrastructure so that First Nations can constructively engage. So you have a group that was founded in BC but is now national, called the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. And they were very involved, for example, in the Coastal GasLink and LNG Canada project. And what you saw is that the organization allows First Nations who are members, and it's a First Nations owned and led organization, that they are positioned to have the financial knowledge, the knowledge of project underwriting, and all of the different pieces that one would need so that they can negotiate a good agreement, a benefit sharing agreement, an equity stake, or whatever it is. What you've seen in the US that's been a bit of a challenge is with the Inflation Reduction Act and others, you have what's called the Tribal Energy Loan Guarantee Program. And they've had a hard time getting uptake on that, in part because there's no infrastructure in place to help build trust. Because the relationship between resource companies and First Nations has not been great, to put it mildly, in the past. And so naturally speaking, there's skepticism on the part of both groups. And what entities like the First Nations Major Projects Coalition have been able to do is to bridge that gap, and so that the First Nations feel, who are members of it, that they have the best advisors who are fully in their corner and who are helping to drive their best agreement vis-a-vis companies. And that means that they are able to meet very much as equals and ensure that both parties get a good arrangement. It's not a panacea, but finding ways to have trust building and trust connectivity institutions is something that's going to be crucially important to making this work. And we're in an early stage, but the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, which according to their website has mobilized 17 billion in capital investment so far across Canada, is a good example of the sort of thing that can be done in the future to not only get the critical minerals we need, but the energy products and other natural resources.
Thank you, Eric. I just want to remind viewers that if you have a question and it doesn't need to be something we've talked about already, you can put in a question and juice us to talk about something we haven't spoken of, but that you're interested in. So please put your questions into the Zoom Q&A function. I want to dig into something which we're talking about being in the early stages here of ginning up the policies, getting the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, processes in place. Canada trying to react to the IRA, and we'll see maybe what's tweaked in the budget. But even with the IRA, for example, we're expecting to see some guidance come out of the U.S. Department of the Treasury, probably by the end of this month, that will clarify sort of the conditions that will apply to money available for processing minerals. And the way the guidance from Treasury suggests right now is it opens up a much bigger universe for who could be able to say this meets the criteria of the Inflation Reduction Act, and therefore we can get a whole bunch of money. There are some who say, look, that set of criteria need to be narrowed significantly in order to make it economically viable for us to build some of these things in Canada or even in the United States. Senator Manchin, who's the chair of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee in the U.S. Senate, is saying, Treasury Department, you have to make sure that we tighten the constraints here so that we're not giving money to somebody who's doing work outside the United States. That's just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? I mean, there's a whole lot of work that has to happen, and Canada is sort of even behind that curve. It seems like we have a lot of issues to get through where there's a harmonious North American kind of stance where all the cylinders are firing, together. So I guess one of the questions I have is, and this is to everybody, is Chrystia Freeland's really has to come up with something in this budget that addresses the challenge of the U.S. invested incentives. And we're seeing little bits and pieces pop out in the news cycle. But, really, it seems to me that are we going to have to wait until the budget day, or do you think we might see more concrete an agreement between the president and the prime minister sort of on some of these factors?
I can start on one part of that. I think that one of the things that's important within the IRA is that it actually provides a unique carve out in a way, not explicitly, but implicitly includes Canada in a way that facilitates a really positive conversation. And I don't think that there is specifically anything the United States government wants to see as an IRA response from Canada. I do think that there is a discussion they want to have on permitting, but it's hard for them to have that discussion on permitting because it's not substantially easier to permit a mine in the United States than it is in Canada. So you're kind of chasing your tail on that a little bit, but I think there is an agreement that all of these things have to be done quickly. We all need to be in a position to ensure that these critical minerals are available for the vehicles as they're being built in order to achieve the transition that both governments have said they're looking to achieve. There are some kind of notable things coming out in the next bit. I mean, there's a the readjustment of the CAFE standards will be coming out in soon. I think I was going to say this month, but this month is almost over. So we'll say soon. And I think that the alignment between the two countries on those issues is really critical. You have one market in North America, and you want to make sure, I think the Americans want to make sure that Canada is playing with that same same playbook. And whether it's on safety, whether it's on emissions, anything that goes into those vehicles, it's really important to all the automakers, I think, that produce for the North American market, that it's consistent. But I think, you know, a lot of the IRA discussion that we're having in Canada misses the fact that Canada is actually inside the tent for a lot of this. There are other countries, other actors that are out there pushing back harder against some of the IRA provisions, and they're scrambling for some space. Canada should be careful not to be one of those, because it doesn't have to. A lot of what we really have to underscore is, where are the places that Canada can really win, and how can they go about creating that environment so that those investments come here and are built up here, and not see it so much as a competition with the United States, but something we can do in collaboration.
Yeah, so, but I'll jump in. So on the IRA, there's a couple of provisions that folks need to be aware of. There is under the so-called 45X provision, if you're building a qualifying facility, you get a 10% operating or OPEX tax credit forever. It basically has no expiration date. So that's a very powerful incentive for people wanting to build facilities in the US. You can also choose to take an up to 30% capital expenditure or CapEx credit if you're building a new facility, that up to 30% under the so-called 48C provisions. And then we've heard a lot about the so-called 30D provisions, which are the consumer tax credits, and that have requirements about up to 80% of critical minerals have to come from the US or an FTA partner, or 100% of necessary components have to come. And so the real question for Canada in terms of its investment posture is, A, what are the areas that one wants to focus on? Because you can't, as an economy a tenth the size, you can't match the US dollar for dollar. But that's okay if the US is going to do certain things that you're not focused on. And the second piece is, do you have to be co-equal with a facility in the US if you are going after it? And the answer is generally not, because there's a lot of different factors which play into it. And Canada's successful pursuit of Volkswagen saw very important factors, including the cost of electricity, the cleanliness of electricity, quality of life, and other factors. And so different companies have different factors that they will essentially look at. And Canada can compete as long as it is able to be within the range in the areas where it feels it wants to be within the range. But Sarah's right that a lot of this is about thinking about what is the place within the bigger North American supply chain. And you've seen Minister Champagne on semiconductors talking a lot about the packaging infrastructure for the semiconductors that exists in Montreal. And so the more that we are able to build those connectivities, the better off for Canada. And also, candidly, over the medium term, if you're not dealing with a Biden administration, but you're dealing with a more populist administration of the varietal that was seen with President Trump, interconnectivity actually translates into leverage, because it means that both countries need each other in order to get an end result in terms of a product or a deliverable. So I think things to think about with the IRA.
I want to let us move. Sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
There's just one other thing that I think is important on the bilateral trade relationship. And one of the things that I think they're probably going to talk about at some point during these meetings is, there's a lot of legislation in Canada on digital trade and on the digital ecosystem that causes a lot of US entities a lot of concern. And so I think that one of the things that we need to ensure moving forward is that the playing field is primed for cooperation between the United States and Canada on digital aspects, because data is something that crosses the border. and it doesn't pay any attention to it. And so how those pieces of legislation go through the process, are amended or not, are implemented through regulatory pieces, all of that, and there's like 4 or 5 of them right now sitting in front of Parliament. That's going to be a key part of a lot of these discussions, because a lot of those the American government feels very strongly about.
Beth, I'd love to have your perspective maybe on that issue.
Ooh. So I think that there are a lot of moving pieces on this, and Canada has, I think, again, I will say, been playing a bit of catch up, trying to line themselves with the EU on some of the digital pieces, but also carving out their own sort of table stakes. And it is a challenging piece, and I know it is concerning. I think that Sarah's right, and that alignment piece, but it also ties into what Eric was saying earlier, making sure that there's a bit of synergy and this opportunity to show the extent to which Canada and the US are sort of intertwined and can work together. That will be sort of the piece that I think that will be something that Canada can leverage to make sure that despite our size and what we bring to the table, we are at the table. So I think that synergy is really important, and it does parlay into these ongoing digital discussions with AI, the DST, et cetera. Like there's a lot moving right now, and it is. I think Champagne has been very clear that he'd like to see this kind of wrapped up quickly. That's not always the best way to take on complex and sort of intertwined legislation, but we'll see where we land with that.
Thanks, Beth. Let's move to a bit of a forward-leaning or forward-looking issue. So, we're seeing, as you noted, Eric, President Biden's moving into campaign mode for the 2024 general election. Justin Trudeau is thinking sort of similar timelines, but there's a lot of conflict or concern, I guess, in Canada, a lot of political partisan interesting things happening. What is President Biden facing? And as we look at the major issues that he's confronting, give us some sense of how this might affect the Canadian US relationship.
So the most immediate thing in the US domestic context is the decision of whether or not to raise the so-called debt ceiling. So the US has a statutory borrowing limit. It hit that statutory borrowing limit of $32.4 trillion in January. And so Secretary Yellen announced that the US government would begin what was called extraordinary measures, where essentially they're borrowing money from pension funds and so on. But her ability to do that essentially runs out, it is estimated, around the 5th of June. And so unless the debt ceiling is raised, the US will default on its debt, which would be a monumental earthquake to the US and global economies. Because you've seen a great deal of skepticism on the part of House Republicans, which are trying to use this as a way of driving spending cuts. And we can certainly talk about that. They also are arguing, which is something that many experts disagree with, that you can prioritize and in essence pay foreign bondholders over American soldiers, pensioners, and others in order to keep the US from defaulting. But we are just weeks away now from a very messy showdown, which will see the US either default or not. One should certainly hope that they do not default, but this would be a kind of monumental earthquake that would, by definition, shape not only the economy, but the narrative around 2024. And what you saw the last time with when the Republicans in the House were pushing hard on brinksmanship with the debt ceiling, you saw it not work out so well for the Republicans. And so we will have to see how this ultimately plays itself out. But the Speaker of the House of Representatives is weaker than he was in 2013. The ability to marshal a coalition within the Republican caucus to vote for an increase of the debt ceiling is much weaker than it was in 2013. So there's a lot of structural conditions in place that could lead to a potentially very bad outcome. And so if we don't get economic catastrophe, then you look at a 2024 campaign, which will be focused a lot on President Biden's age, and do we want someone who is more in the populist mode? You've seen the Republican primaries kicking up with Ron DeSantis being a leading contender. You also have the prospect of Donald Trump being indicted and fighting both for the presidency and for his own legal freedom and things of that nature. But there are a lot of conditions which could be headwinds against President Biden. But for now, if I were him, I would probably be liking what I was looking at, because the economy has continued to be reasonably resilient. Employment growth has been reasonably resilient. Inflation is starting to taper off, although we'll have to see what the Fed does. But there are a number of very big bombshells ahead that could profoundly shape the 2024 election. And if the narrative is the House Republicans don't raise the debt ceiling, the US defaults and blows up the world economy, that would be an argument President Biden would want to run on, and that perhaps Ron DeSantis or one of his peers would not want to run on.
Right. There's a lot to think about as we head towards the future.
So invest wisely, but invest wisely.
Yeah, I've got my money in the under the mattress. Beth, I'm wondering, we do have I think a few people have posed questions. Is there a question we might want to throw out to the panel?
Just doing a quick read.
No worries.
So the first question I think is probably, Eric, back to something that you had spoken about earlier, and I guess what you had just said. With all the instability in the US government, how stable is it for First Nations to make an agreement with the US?
Oh, the rule of law persists in the US. I mean, the US is a somewhat, it can be a wild and chaotic place, at least if you believe what you see on CNN. But by and large, it is a country where lawyers and the law are very much have primacy. And so there are lots of different agreements. One of the things that I think is fascinating right now is that you have Deb Haaland, who's the first Native American Secretary of the Interior, which is the part of the US government responsible for dealing with Native American issues. And so she's been doing a series of meetings all throughout the country that are essentially like an early version of what you saw in Canada 15 years ago with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so there's a lot of discussions around the horrendous experiences of Native American boarding schools, missing and murdered women, the experiences of having land taken away. And you do have some property rights. So, for example, 3 years ago, the US Supreme Court gave Eastern Oklahoma, so half of the entire state, to a Native American group, including the whole city of Tulsa. And so that's been something that has been had to work through. And so, we in North America and in many parts of the Western world are trying to figure out what is the pathway for relations between First Nations and central governments. But if the US government does make an agreement and the Native American tribes do not feel that those agreements are respected, they can and will go to court. The question on resources is, do we have trust with mining industry and energy industry and so on, who before, thanks to the guidance of the Secretary of the Interior, has been able to essentially produce billions of dollars of resources on native-owned land without having to pay much in the way of royalties to the native communities. A lot of that legacy is affecting development today. But fundamentally, when you have seen cases, there are many cases of litigation where First Nations are going to court and asserting their rights. And in the United States, you're seeing a real cultural shift, not much reported on, but a real cultural shift around how both the federal and the state governments are dealing with these communities. And so I think much is going to change in the next 15 years in that regard, just like it's changed in Canada over the last 15 years.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. We got about 5 minutes left, and I want to go around the panel and ask what key indicators should we be looking at in the bilateral relationship, like over the next 12 to 18 months. What should our viewers sort of be interested in keeping their finger on the pulse of? So I'll start with Sarah, then go to Eric, and then go to Beth, and then if we have a little bit of time left at the end, we might take one last question from the webinar viewers. So Sarah.
So, I mean, in terms of this visit and lasting implications, I think it's really interesting. I was looking at the Politico playbook title today from Ottawa, which is 27-hour BFF reset, and then the Politico Washington playbook was Ahoy Canada, and I think that tells you a lot right there in the different positionings between the two targeted newsletters. I think that there's a lot of chaos right now in the environment. There's a lot of chaos both within the economies as we're trying to figure out how to get, global economies moved out of this kind of inflationary trench. Also, I think there's a lot of chaos right now in how we think about food security and how we think about energy security that has to do with global events and the war in Ukraine. And so, how Canada plays into these conversations in the next year, I think will be in direct relation to a lot of what's talked about today. And I think probably the single biggest takeaway, there's been a lot of discussion on how when President Obama came up and did his address to Parliament, he said the world needs more Canada, which was kind of a bit of a pat on the back, but more of a push from behind saying, please do more. And I think that that's the same message you're going to see from the Biden administration to the Trudeau government is we need more. We need more of whatever you can bring, and you have to figure out how to do this faster. You have to figure out how to spend defense money in a way that actually gets things on the ground to people who need them, that actually builds up your Canadian Armed Forces so that you can be an active participant globally and not have to continually constrict your activities based on a shrinking footprint of membership within the Canadian Armed Forces, among other things. So I think they'll be pushed on a lot of that. I think, we haven't talked about Haiti, and I don't think we really need to spend much time on it because everybody else is talking about it. But I think that's an area where it's one of those places where the United States cannot do what the United States really wants to see done, but Canada could. And so all of those areas in the world where being the United States is in some ways a detraction from their ability to be effective, and many of those places, Canada can do the work that needs to be done to stabilize the environment, to protect individuals, to protect human security. And there's a place if you have the resources to pull that off. And so I think that will be a lot of the underscoring that comes out of these conversations today.
Thank you, Sarah. Eric, we got about 30 seconds for you and maybe 30 seconds for Beth.
Okay. National defense spending will be, I think, really crucially important. Another dimension I would put in there just from the Canadian domestic context is I'm interested that Pierre Poilievre is talking about softwood lumber and whether or not we're actually going to see a strong push to try to get a softwood lumber agreement that could see the now $7 billion in duties refunded, at least in part, to Canadian producers. And so there has to be some trade issues. And, I guess you could say cynically, Mr. Polyev demanded a 30-day resolution to Rocks and Road, and the government delivered. So, the question becomes, do we see anything on softwood lumber? And can Canadian lumber producers look for some relief in that area?
Thank you. Beth, final word.
Yeah, I would agree with what Sarah and Eric have said. I think one of the themes that's come through this chat we've had over the last hour is this idea about collective institutions. And there are a lot of institutions right now that are at a breaking point. And I do think building up confidence in those institutions over a long period of time, that's going to be the real sort of forward-looking piece. And how that happens and what approach both countries take to that and how they work on that together, I think is going to be really important in terms of moving forward.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Eric. Fantastic conversation. Really appreciate it all. And to our viewers, thank you for tuning in, and stay awake. We'll see what else happens over the next 8 to 10 hours. Thanks a lot, everybody.